By dawn, the four daughters were gone, but their voices still echoed through the house they built. The corridors, long and cold, seemed to sigh with their absence, and the walls, once vibrant with portraits and polished oak, had dimmed into muted shadows that whispered secrets of a past no one dared speak aloud. Before we continue, take a breath. The past is closer than you think. Subscribe to remember what others forgot. The Hawthorne estate sat like a sentinel at the edge of the fog-draped town, half hidden in ivy and creeping moss. Its turrets pierced the low-hanging mist, their pointed spires shivering in the pale morning light. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and burning wax, and the distant clatter of shutters against walls carried through the silence. This house, with its labyrinthine hallways and cavernous rooms, held the rhythm of lives dictated by whispers and obedience. No visitor lingered long without feeling the weight of unseen eyes. Master Hawthorne was a man both revered and feared. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a voice that rolled like distant thunder, he moved through his house with the quiet authority of one who measured every word, every glance, every breath. His eyes were dark pools, reflective and calculating, hiding a mind that traced every possibility, every secret. The townsfolk rarely saw him beyond the estate gates, yet his presence was felt in every murmur of the marketplace, every hesitation in conversation, as though even the air around him carried the authority of his unseen hand. Inside the estate, four daughters lived beneath the shadow of their father's dominion. Clara, the eldest, bore the solemnity of one who had learned silence before she could speak freely. Her steps were measured, her eyes deep pools that seemed to hold ancient knowledge, or perhaps an enduring sorrow. Amelia, the youngest, carried a strange luminescence in her pale hair, though it was not youth alone that made it ghostly, it was as if some inherited strain of the house had leached her vitality into something fragile and ethereal. Beatrice and Lillian, twins, were often seen wandering the corridors at twilight, their laughter muted by caution, their glances searching for something unseen. There was an unspoken understanding among them. Life at Hawthorne Estate was a delicate performance, one that balanced beauty against fear. And then there was the slave, known to the household and servants alike as Thorn. His presence was a storm contained, a figure of towering strength and quiet menace. He spoke little, moved with measured grace, and was bound to the house by debts older than memory itself. The staff whispered of his obedience, but also of the strange aura that clung to him, an energy that seemed neither wholly human nor entirely malleable. Some said he had been chosen, some cursed, and some claimed he carried the echoes of 1,000 wrongs. Life within the estate followed a cadence of subtle terror. Meals were taken in long dining halls lit by flickering candles whose wax ran like tears down the sides of candelabras. The daughters attended their lessons under the careful watch of tutors, each hour punctuated by the distant creak of floorboards or the faint clink of keys in the master's study. Even in their private chambers, where sunlight barely penetrated the tall windows, the feeling of being observed never fully lifted. At night, the girls whispered to each other under heavy quilts, voices hushed, for the shadows themselves seemed to listen. On this particular evening, a storm crept in from the distant hills. The wind rattled the shutters and the fog rolled closer, curling through the estate like a living thing. Candlelight quivered across the walls as if startled by some hidden motion. Thorn moved silently through the halls, checking locks, adjusting the placement of heavy curtains, ensuring every shadow was in its place. The daughters felt his gaze even when he was absent, and in that feeling unease deepened. It was Beatrice who first noticed the anomaly. A door on the upper landing, usually tightly shut, stood ajar despite no one having entered. Its hinges groaned softly as though protesting the intrusion of air, yet no one was near. Lillian glanced over her shoulder and caught a shadow flit past the candlelight. Amelia shivered, convinced that the walls themselves were breathing. Clara, ever silent, simply stared toward the door with narrowed eyes, as though the very air had whispered some forbidden truth to her. Outside, the town remained unaware of the undercurrents that ran through the Hawthorne estate. To them it was a grand house, a mark of prominence and wealth, yet hidden within were the rhythms of fear and compulsion. The wind carried whispers of the estate, rumors that Thorn was more than a servant, that the daughters were kept for purposes no one dared name. Mothers pulled children closer when they passed the gates, and men walked quickly, casting uneasy glances toward the ivy-choked walls. Yet no one dared enter. That night, as the storm's crescendo battered the roof and windows, a single candle in the master's study burned low. The door creaked open wider on its own, and a soft, deliberate step echoed from the corridor. Somewhere in the house, a whisper threaded through the silence, a syllable unfinished, a warning left unspoken. The daughters drew closer together in their chamber, clutching each other's hands as the air seemed to thicken with anticipation. Outside the study, Thorn paused, sensing rather than seeing, and for a moment the world held its breath. It was the first of many nights where shadows moved without shape, where whispers spoke of deeds unrecorded, and where the air itself seemed to carry the weight of secrets that could not be named aloud. In this house, beneath the watchful eyes of Master Hawthorne, the ordinary was a fragile veil over something dark and inexorable. And though no one could yet see it, the pattern had begun, the first tremors of a story that would stain the walls and echo for decades, long after dawn broke and bodies were gone. The fog that clung to the Hawthorne estate seemed heavier now, as though it sensed the tension building within the walls. Each morning the town whispered anew. Shopkeepers exchanged uneasy glances over the counters, their voices low, as if the words themselves might summon the dread they feared. The estate's gates, once only a symbol of wealth, now carried a different weight, a warning, a boundary no one in the village wished to cross. Inside, Master Hawthorne moved with deliberate precision, his every step a calculation. He surveyed his daughters with an intensity that seemed to pierce flesh and bone alike, measuring them in ways no tutor or servant could understand. Clara's solemnity deepened, and even the twins' mischievous glances were shadowed with a creeping caution. Amelia, fragile and luminous, withdrew further into herself, as if the air carried whispers that only she could hear. Thorn, the slave, became an ever-present shadow in their lives. His silence was both comfort and terror. To the daughters he was a paradox, protector yet reminder of the master's will, obedient yet unstoppable in his presence. He moved through halls and chambers with a rhythm that no one dared disrupt. Sometimes at night, he would stand at the end of a corridor, listening to the wind, and the girls would glimpse him from their windows, immovable as if part of the shadows themselves. Odd events began to ripple through the estate like stones thrown into a still pond. Candles flickered despite no draught, their flames bending toward corners as though drawn by unseen fingers. Portraits seemed to watch the daughters more intently, their painted eyes reflecting secret knowledge. Furniture shifted subtly, drawers left slightly open, books misplaced, keys vanishing for hours. The girls whispered among themselves, each instance a puzzle, each silence a threat. One evening, Beatrice reported hearing a voice calling her name from the cellar, low and urgent, though she had been alone in her chamber. Lillian insisted she had seen shadows move against the walls in patterns that made no sense. Amelia, her voice barely audible, murmured of feeling watched while dressing, of footsteps echoing in empty corridors. Clara did not speak, yet her sharp glances toward the master's study and Thorn conveyed understanding that frightened even the twins. Rumors in town began to shift from polite curiosity to unease. A baker claimed to see a figure of unnatural size lurking near the estate's walls at dusk. Children who wandered too close reported the sound of chains and muffled cries that vanished when they turned. Merchants who passed by on business days whispered that the daughters were rarely seen in daylight, appearing only at windows when the sun was low. The estate had grown a reputation not only for wealth and prestige, but for a kind of darkness that clung to the very stones. Within the house, tension thickened with every passing night. Conversations were measured, glances studied, and every step calculated. The daughters moved like dancers on a stage where a misstep could summon reprimand, or worse, the scrutiny of the master. Thorn's presence, always near, served as both shield and reminder. Obedience was demanded, yet the shadow of possibility, the unknown act unspoken, remained. It was Clara who first noticed the change in the household staff. They whispered behind closed doors, glancing toward the master's study or Thorn with suspicion. Servants avoided each other in hallways, exchanging furtive glances, as if the walls themselves carried warnings. One maid claimed to hear the daughters speaking to someone unseen in the attic, while another swore that the same person appeared silently behind the youngest girl in the drawing room. No one dared confirm anything, yet the pattern of fear was undeniable. The tension culminated on a night of oppressive fog. Candles flickered, shutters rattled, and distant thunder seemed to punctuate the house's unease. In the east wing, Amelia awoke to the faint sound of chains dragging across the floor. She rose, heart hammering, and moved silently toward the source. A shadow slipped along the hallway wall, Thorn's form, impossibly tall, impossibly silent. He paused, listening. The air grew colder and the candle flames quivered as though in terror. Amelia froze. The master's voice then carried down the hall, soft, deliberate, chilling. A single word, spoken almost as a hiss, was enough to send her reeling back into her chamber. The daughters began to exchange glances heavy with silent understanding. Something was unfolding, something deliberate, something that had begun long before their awareness. Each creak of floorboards, each whisper of wind, each flicker of flame felt like an omen, and yet the true nature of the horror remained veiled. Suspicion wrapped around them like the fog outside, thick and suffocating. Meanwhile, Thorn moved with purpose that the daughters could feel but not predict. Sometimes, he lingered at the foot of the stairs, sometimes in the shadowed corners of the study. He listened, observed, and waited. Even the master, whose eyes seemed to calculate every possibility, did not fully reveal his intentions. The estate itself became a theater of silent menace, where fear was both curtain and stage. Toward the end of the week, a subtle but undeniable shift occurred. The daughters awoke to find small tokens of warning left in their rooms: hair strands tied in knots, a single candle melted into shapes resembling clawed hands, faint scratches along the floorboards that traced paths leading nowhere. Clara did not speak, but her stare in the mirror seemed to reflect more than her own reflection. It captured the house itself as if it had begun speaking through her eyes. Outside, the townsfolk whispered of Thorn's impossible strength, of the master's obsession with bloodlines and lineage, and of the daughters who were rarely seen but whose presence seemed to haunt every alley and market stall. Curiosity and fear mingled until both became caution. No one dared approach the estate. The air of dread became tangible, a living thing pressing against doors and windows, breathing through the fog. And yet, within the house, the most dangerous truths remained hidden. Master Hawthorne continued his routines, Thorn executed silent commands, and the daughters waited, watched, and felt the encroaching weight of a fate they could not name. In the quietest hours, when the storm outside raged and the fog swallowed the estate in a gray embrace, whispers traced the corridors, the beginnings of forbidden acts, the prelude to horror that would soon unravel the fragile semblance of normalcy. In the shadows of the east wing, a door remained closed. Behind it, silence pressed outward. No one dared open it, and yet the daughters felt its presence with every heartbeat. Something waited there, a consequence, a revelation, a terror, that would not remain contained. And in the heart of the estate, Thorn's gaze lingered, unblinking, as if he alone understood the shape of what was to come. The fog thickened outside, curling like smoke around the turrets. Within the Hawthorne estate, dread had taken root, a living thing feeding on fear, patience, and the unspoken design of a master who measured lives as one might measure candles in a hall, each flame fragile, each shadow deliberate. The estate seemed to breathe in the darkness, each wall pulsing with secrets that had waited decades to be named. Candles guttered in the long halls, their flames bending toward corners where shadows seemed alive, almost sentient. It was in such a night, thick with fog and the scent of damp earth, that the first undeniable truths began to surface. Clara discovered the journals hidden behind a false panel in the master's study. Their leather covers were cracked with age, the ink faded but unmistakable. Each page spoke in careful, deliberate handwriting, chronicling events that no one in the town had dared imagine. The words were not merely records, they were confessions, outlines of a design that had bound daughters and slave alike into a pattern of control, cruelty, and forbidden acts. Master Hawthorne's obsession with bloodlines, with heredity, with the strange perfection he sought in his daughters, became horrifyingly clear. The journals revealed meticulous planning, the arranging of circumstances, the conditioning of Thorn to serve not merely as a servant but as an instrument of the master's ambition. Every detail of his daughters' lives, from what they ate to the hours they spent awake and asleep, had been catalogued, monitored, and manipulated. Beatrice found another revelation, hidden in the east wing beneath loose floorboards, a series of letters written to a figure only referred to as the instrument. The letters described with clinical detachment the master's intentions, the precise timing, the desired outcome of an act that had been whispered about but never spoken aloud. The daughters realized that the rumors they had heard from townsfolk, the obscured hints of an unnatural union, were not merely superstition. They were preparation, anticipation, and inevitability. The house itself seemed to acknowledge the collapse of innocence. Doors slammed without wind, shadows coalesced into shapes that clung to corners, and the air grew thick, almost viscous, with dread. The daughters, who had long felt the weight of their father's presence, began to sense that every step, every breath, was part of a cruelly orchestrated design. Thorn, ever silent, became both a witness and a participant in a reality none of them had yet fully comprehended. His gaze followed them in ways that were unsettling and yet strangely protective. One night, as a storm rattled the estate with relentless fury, Amelia found herself at the door of the west wing, a place long avoided. Beyond it lay a room locked since childhood and now, by some force unseen, it seemed to call her. She opened the door slowly, the hinges groaning like the house itself was in pain. Inside, shadows pooled across the floor. Candles, their flames blackened at the tips, revealed objects she could not name. Garments, chains, implements whose purpose she feared to imagine. And in the center of the room, a small cradle sat empty, save for a single strand of pale hair and a note scrawled in her father's hand. The design is complete. The bloodline shall endure. Clara, Beatrice, and Lillian gathered in that room in terror and understanding. The truth, impossible and grotesque, pressed upon them like a physical weight. Their father's intentions, their own role within them, the fate of Thorn, all converged in a single moment of clarity. They were no longer merely daughters. They were instruments in a plan that had begun long before their awareness, a plan that twisted family, obedience, and flesh into a pattern beyond morality or law. The collapse was inevitable. That night, when the candles flickered and the storm screamed against the estate's stone walls, the household fractured. Thorn moved with a purpose that was both mechanical and deliberate, carrying out commands whispered long ago, yet now executed with a weight that felt like revolt. The daughters, trembling, attempted to resist, to run, to scream, yet every corridor and locked door seemed to conspire against them. The estate, alive with decades of dread, closed around them. In the study, Master Hawthorne stood over the journals and letters, the storm outside reflecting in his dark eyes. For a brief moment, he looked human, and then, as if the weight of his own design pressed down, he stiffened, transformed into the embodiment of his obsession. His plan, perfected and executed, could not be undone, and yet he sensed, perhaps too late, that the instruments of his ambition were no longer purely obedient. The daughters, the slave, the very house itself had begun to resist, in ways subtle but undeniable. Outside, the townsfolk noticed the storm had shifted. Lightning struck in patterns unnatural, thunder rolled with uncanny timing, and fog clung lower than ever. The estate seemed to exhale, and those with the courage, or misfortune, to peer through the trees claimed they saw shadows moving in unison, shapes that were not quite human. The air carried whispers, and in those whispers a name, Hawthorne. By the following dawn, the household was fractured beyond repair. The daughters, their innocence and certainty shattered, moved as ghosts within the house they once called home. Thorn, whose role had been both servitude and subjugation, now carried an awareness that bordered on sentience, as if he alone comprehended the full scope of what had been enacted. Master Hawthorne, once omnipotent within the walls, began to understand that control, no matter how meticulous, could never fully contain consequence. The estate, a living monument to obsession and cruelty, became a stage for collapse. Candles burned low, shadows lingered longer than physics should allow, and the wind outside whispered of acts that could not be undone. The daughters' laughter, once light and cautious, now carried tremors of hysteria. Their footsteps echoed like hollow drums across empty corridors. Even the portraits seemed to shiver, as if the painted eyes could feel the unraveling of reality itself. In this moment of revelation, horror, and collapse, the truth was indisputable. Master Hawthorne's designs, no matter how hidden or deliberate, had reached their apex. The forbidden act, the manipulation of bloodlines, the use of Thorn as both instrument and witness, had not only succeeded but poisoned everything it touched. The house, the daughters, the slave, and the master himself were bound together in an inevitable spiral, one that would echo long after the storm passed, long after the estate had become a haunted relic. By nightfall, silence fell over the estate. Yet even in that silence, the air was thick with the weight of what had been revealed. Shadows lingered in corners, the daughters' footsteps sounded in unison as if echoing through time, and Thorn, standing at the threshold of a hall that had seen decades of cruelty, looked outward, his face unreadable, knowing that the final reckoning had begun, but was not yet complete. The estate's walls seemed to pulse with a heartbeat that no one living could hear, yet all felt. The corridors, once merely shadowed, now quivered with a presence that was almost tangible, as if the house itself had become aware of the events unfolding within it. Candlelight, which had once merely flickered, now danced with a frantic energy, casting grotesque shapes against peeling wallpaper and the portraits of ancestors who seemed to watch in disapproval or horror. Master Hawthorne moved like a wraith through his own halls, his presence suffocating, his plans no longer secret but exposed, even if only to him. He whispered to the air as though conversing with the walls themselves. His daughters, whose innocence had been eroded by design, now trembled under a weight they could neither name nor escape. Each step they took echoed not just through wood and stone, but through the very essence of the estate, leaving tremors in its shadowed corridors. Thorn became increasingly central to the unfolding horror. His strength, once only a source of obedience, now carried menace and inevitability. He moved silently, a sentinel of inevitability, enforcing a will that seemed older than memory itself. The daughters flinched at his shadow, not knowing if it was protection or prelude to another layer of suffering. Even the servants, who had once whispered among themselves in fear, now avoided any glance at him, as if acknowledging a power beyond human comprehension. One night, as fog pressed against the tall windows and lightning split the sky, a strange ritual unfolded in the east wing. The daughters were compelled to follow a sequence of commands whose meaning they barely understood, each step meticulously dictated by Master Hawthorne and silently observed by Thorn. Candles burned low, smoke coiling like serpents along the ceiling. Shadows warped unnaturally, stretching longer, twisting into shapes that whispered threats and promises in languages no living tongue could name. The estate itself seemed to rebel against the cruelty it housed. Floorboards shifted, stairs groaned under no visible weight, and doors opened and closed as if guided by invisible hands. The daughters' senses became heightened, each sound amplified: the distant drip of water in the cellar, the scratching of some hidden creature behind a wall, the soft rustle of fabric in the master's study. Every moment was a test, every silence a threat. Outside, the townsfolk noticed the estate's strange transformation. Animals refused to enter the grounds, dogs barked at nothing, cats arched their backs in terror. Travelers spoke of a low, vibrating hum that seemed to emanate from the house itself, a sound that made the hair rise along the nape of the neck. No one dared approach, and those who tried reported glimpses of figures moving in ways impossible to reconcile with human movement, shadows that split and recombined, shapes that vanished when confronted. Inside, the daughter's psychological unraveling deepened. Beatrice began to speak to unseen presences, whispering questions that went unanswered. Lillian's laughter became hollow, echoing through hallways where no other sound existed. Amelia withdrew entirely, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring at corners where shadows curled like living things. Clara, still the calmest, now bore a hardness in her expression, as though she had glimpsed the full scope of her father's intentions and could not unsee them. Thorn, for his part, moved with a methodical precision that both terrified and reassured. Sometimes he would block a doorway, standing immovable like a statue, and the daughters would feel a strange safety in his presence, though they could not name why. At other times he would vanish into corridors and return carrying objects or notes whose significance would only become clear in time. He was both witness and enforcer, a silent participant in a nightmare that was unraveling in real time. Master Hawthorne's obsession with control intensified as the estate itself seemed to take on a life of its own. Every detail mattered: the exact placement of furniture, the angle of candlelight, the precise moment the daughters were called to specific chambers. Any deviation was met with a glance so piercing that even the most courageous servant flinched. He moved like a conductor in a symphony of horror, orchestrating not music, but fear, obedience, and inevitable decay. As the days stretched on, the estate's very air became oppressive. The fog outside seemed to press against windows and doors, curling through gaps in the walls, whispering through the cracks in the floorboards. Shadows became almost tactile, brushing against skin, twisting along the edges of vision. The daughters moved through this living nightmare, trapped not only by walls and doors but by an unseen architecture of dread. Every corridor led somewhere, sometimes nowhere, but always deeper into the house's grasp. One evening, lightning revealed shapes that had never been noticed before. In the attic, four small alcoves had been carved into the walls, hidden behind loose panels and cobwebs. Each contained remnants of clothing, hair, and objects that suggested preparation, documentation, and deliberate intent. The daughters could not fully comprehend it, yet the implication was clear. Their lives had been planned, dissected, and arranged as if they were pieces in a puzzle meant to satisfy something monstrous, unseen, and immovable. The final hour of this escalation arrived in silence, with only a single candle left burning in the main hall. Shadows stretched across the walls like fingers, and the air smelled faintly of iron and smoke. Master Hawthorne stood at the center, surveying his daughters, Thorn at his side. Every heartbeat, every whisper of fabric, every creak of floorboards felt like the prelude to revelation. The house itself seemed to lean in, attentive, as if eager to witness the culmination of decades of obsession and cruelty. In that moment, the estate was no longer a home. It was an organism, alive with fear, memory, and anticipation. The daughters, Thorn, and the master were all pieces within it, moved not merely by will but by the inexorable momentum of fate. And though no voice spoke the truth aloud, every shadow, every flicker of candlelight, every whisper of wind carried a single undeniable message. The consequences were inevitable and horror would not remain contained. Decades had passed, yet the estate never forgot. The ivy-choked walls seemed to breathe, inhaling fog and exhaling whispers. Travelers who dared approach the gates spoke of the same chill, the same unnatural stillness, and of shadows that moved against logic. Even the air felt older here, heavy with memory and dread, carrying the echoes of acts too cruel to fade. The townsfolk, now generations removed from Master Hawthorne's rule, spoke of the estate in hushed tones. They recalled stories passed down through trembling voices, daughters who vanished without explanation, a slave whose eyes glowed with a strange intelligence, and a master whose obsession with bloodlines had left the house steeped in a palpable darkness. Mothers warned their children not to wander near the fog-laden gates. Merchants hurried past and no child dared to peer at the high windows. Yet even with the estate abandoned, the presence of its former inhabitants seemed woven into the very fog. Visitors who entered reported impossible phenomena. Candles, though untouched, would flare violently or extinguish without wind. Floors creaked under invisible weight. Rooms appeared larger or smaller depending on the angle of observation, and shadows refused to conform to any natural law. Some claimed to hear the laughter of children where none lived, while others swore they glimpsed figures moving in corridors that should have been empty. Those who stayed too long sometimes disappeared, their absence whispered in the town's market and taverns, though no record ever confirmed their fate. The legacy of Thorn, the slave, was equally enigmatic. Some claimed he remained bound to the estate, neither alive nor dead, his form a constant presence in the hallways, watching, waiting. Others suggested he had fled the physical world but lingered in memory and shadow, a guardian of secrets and witness to the master's forbidden designs. Wherever he was, his influence persisted. Rooms where he had moved seemed preserved in perfect dread, furniture arranged with unnatural symmetry, as if the estate itself had absorbed him into its architecture. The daughter's memory persisted in spectral form. Travelers reported fleeting glimpses of 4 figures in the windows, indistinct yet unmistakably human, though unnaturally elongated by shadow. Some claimed to hear their voices whispering, sometimes asking questions, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying. One story told of a lone figure standing in the fog outside the estate at midnight, pale hair glinting like moonlight, eyes wide and unblinking, staring toward the town as if recalling the world it had lost. Even nature seemed to acknowledge the estate's curse. Animals avoided the grounds, trees leaned inward as though shielding the house, and fog clung to the walls with a density that seemed impossible. Travelers who lingered too long spoke of a low hum in the air, a vibration in their bones that made their ears ring and their vision warp. Time itself seemed to bend near the estate. Hours could stretch or contract, days felt like weeks, and the moon's light seemed dimmed by the oppressive weight of memory. Some attempted to document the history, hoping that recording the events might exorcise them. Diaries, sketches, and letters were left behind by curious investigators, but few lasted more than a night. Those who tried invariably described the same phenomena: shadows that moved against the grain of perception, whispers that answered questions before they were spoken, and figures glimpsed in mirrors that had no reflection in the world outside. When the investigators left, they often did so changed, their minds fragile, their sleep haunted by the same estate that remained untouched by time. Even the town's architecture seemed to remember. Houses near the estate were said to feel heavier, as if the land itself carried the weight of the Hawthorne curse. Windows fogged inexplicably, floors groaned, and the air often carried the faintest whisper of laughter, crying, or chains. Children spoke of seeing figures in the mist, always at the periphery of vision, figures that vanished when approached but returned when eyes were diverted. The legend of the estate had become inseparable from the landscape, a living cautionary tale that marked all who passed by. In the deepest hours of the night, when the fog pressed close to the estate and the wind moaned like an ancient lament, the echoes of the past became almost tangible. Doors that had not been opened in centuries would creak ajar. A lone candle might ignite spontaneously, illuminating portraits whose eyes seemed alive. Figures, pale, silent, observing, could be glimpsed at the windows, their faces frozen in the terror and understanding of events long past. The estate's legacy was not merely of horror, but of memory itself. The acts of Master Hawthorne, the obedience and presence of Thorn, and the tragic fates of the daughters became intertwined, inseparable from the fog, the shadows, and the whispers that lingered long after the last candle had died. The townsfolk, generations later, still spoke of it in trembling voices, passing on the warning that some places, some stories, and some people refuse to be forgotten. And in the silence, beneath the weight of fog and ivy, the estate waited. Its walls absorbed every glance, every whisper, every step. Shadows shifted in patterns that suggested purpose and remembrance. Somewhere in the halls, Thorn, the daughters, and perhaps even Master Hawthorne remained, bound by the architecture of memory, the geometry of fear, and the inexorable gravity of consequences that could not be erased. The estate had become a repository for all that had occurred within its walls. The manipulation of bloodlines, the cruelty of obsession, and the living terror that accompanied each act. Yet for all its stillness, it was not dead. It pulsed with memory, feeding on fear and whispering to those who dared listen. Every secret endures, every act leaves its echo, and the past never truly dies. By the time the fog lifted over the Hawthorne estate, the world had shifted, though no living witness could fully describe the change. The house, once alive with the intricate rhythms of control and fear, now stood in ruin, its walls cracked, shutters hanging loose, ivy strangling stone like grasping fingers. The storm that had raged for decades within had passed, leaving only echoes, shadows, and the weight of memory. Master Hawthorne was gone, though the exact manner of his departure remained uncertain. Some said he had vanished into the night, swallowed by the very shadows he had commanded. Others whispered that he lingered in the hallways, trapped by the consequences of his own design, a phantom prisoner of obsession. Regardless, his dominion ended not with triumph but with silence, and in that silence, the house itself seemed to mourn and mock in equal measure. The daughters, or what remained of them, were scattered in body, spirit, or legend. Amelia had vanished entirely, leaving only a single strand of silver hair caught in the lattice of a window. Beatrice and Lillian, twisted by fear and despair, became specters, wandering hallways and corridors in forms barely distinguishable from shadows. Clara, the eldest, survived in body, though her mind carried scars etched deeper than flesh, memories of manipulation, loss, and terror that could never be erased. Wherever they were, they existed as living reminders of a plan that had succeeded in intent but failed in its humanity. Thorn, the strongest and most enigmatic of all, became a lingering presence. Some claimed he had died in service to the master's ambition. Others believed he remained, bound to the house as both guardian and witness. Those who glimpsed him in the fog described a figure impossibly tall, impossibly still, with eyes that carried the weight of all he had endured. He was neither fully human nor fully spirit, and the estate seemed incomplete without his quiet, commanding presence. The town, too, bore the imprint of Hawthorne's legacy. Fields near the estate yielded strange growths, animals refused to tread upon the grounds, and travelers often spoke of a low hum in the air, a vibration that unsettled the bones. Children refused to venture near the crumbling gates, and even the bravest adults felt their courage falter when shadows lengthened in impossible ways. The story of the estate became inseparable from the fog, the ivy, and the air itself, a cautionary tale told and retold in trembling voices, carrying the weight of horror, legend, and memory. Even decades later, the estate retained its sinister vitality. Windows caught reflections of figures who should not have existed. Doors opened and closed with a mind of their own. Footsteps echoed in empty corridors. Those who dared enter spoke of whispers that carried secrets from the past, of the daughters' laughter and crying entwined into a sound both haunting and incomprehensible. And in the darkest corners, Thorn's presence was felt, a guardian of memory, a keeper of consequences, a shadow whose allegiance to the master's design was both complete and terrifyingly ambiguous. The estate became more than a place, it became a testament to obsession, to cruelty, to ambition unchecked. It stood as proof that actions, even those carefully calculated, carry reverberations far beyond the lives of those who enact them. Bloodlines were tainted, innocence corrupted, and yet, in the decay and silence, a strange beauty lingered, the architecture of consequence, the poetry of dread, and the inevitability of memory. And so, the story concluded, not with resolution but with endurance. The walls held the echoes of 4 daughters, a master, and a servant who had been forced into roles not of their choosing. Shadows carried warnings. Fog remembered. Candles flickered in the memories of all who had glimpsed the estate. Time moved on, but it moved differently here, slowed, weighted with history that refused to forget. If this story lingered in your thoughts, let it live a little longer. Like and subscribe for more forgotten voices. Remember the whispers in the walls, the steps that go unheard, and the fog that hides more than it reveals. The Hawthorne estate waits, timeless, patient, and full of secrets, for those who dare to listen. This completes part 6, Aftermath and Poetic Closure, giving the story a haunting resolution, showing the ruin, the lingering spirits, Thorne's ambiguous presence, and leaving the legacy in a gothic, cinematic echo.